everyone, welcome back for chapter two of Ethics of Care by Fiona Robinson. I just realized that I kind of sound like a podcast after saying that, but we're going to go ahead and jump right in because I'm trying to keep these videos a lot shorter than I've been doing for the last two. Um, but real quick, we kind of get into this critique of a current security studies and what it should look like. What does care ethics kind of have to do with it, and how does that answer the question? Robinson, she just kind of jumps like right into it, and where we're at today and why she finds it so critical that we change or implement these new moral ideas. So she essentially starts with saying essentially our current security studies essentially concerned with the ways in which our normative and ontological understandings of security serve to reinforce rather than challenge existing relations of power, thus perpetuating and even deepening conditions of insecurity for much of the world's population. And then she kind of goes on to implement, this feminist perspective and says a feminist care ethics approach to security allows us to see, the effects of gender, race, class, and geopolitics in constructing accounts of security while simultaneously revealing the fundamental importance of relations of care to the everyday security of people in the households and communities. Ethics of care approach to security, I argue, disrupts existing discourses in hopes of license and construct alternative discursive realities, one that may involve less suffering and harm inflicted to people in the context of their communities. She kind of goes on again. Critical ethics of care disrupts and challenges the dichotomy between individual and the collective. And then she kind of goes on into this autonomous actors and macro level regimes, all this fun stuff, kind of stuff. Most of those quotes, kind of just mean different things of like the same aspect. But she essentially is saying, like, at this point, like, current security studies is just not ideal. And she's saying that all of these moral, implications and implementations that we could be making are going to get us there. But like, how? And she kind of goes into this humanitarian intervention, which we're going to talk about in the next few upcoming chapters. But essentially, she's saying where we're at, like, is not okay. Like, we're at the very beginning, and let's see what we can do to like change this dichotomy and to introduce like gender-based um, issues and recognizing that they're there and staying aware. And then she goes on for human rights versus human security. How do they coexist or conflict? And I think this is really, really interesting because I know we talked about it a little bit with Confucian ethics and this, this consideration of whether human rights applies and to what extent is it helpful. And I think for her, like, it's not like useful and it doesn't help. It doesn't like give a lot for her moral thinking. And so she's arguing for a shift away from understanding human security is based on the provision of individual human rights. This is where my first kind of question comes. And I'm essentially asking, like, what are the pros and cons to like this kind of shift from like shifting away from the provision of individual human rights? Does this outlook kind of undervalue human rights for you or just make it like a better stepping stool? And I know like she goes into really big depth on like saying that she is not intentionally like undervaluing human rights or she doesn't want to, but of course like that's her opinion. So I'm just curious, like, if y'all still see it like that or if you genuinely think that she is like setting it up for a good stage of like, this is our first step, and then human rights serves as a purpose and as like the bare minimum, but like, here we go, like, here's the next step. And so I mean, personally, I think she definitely uh somewhat accomplishes that. I'm just curious to whether like this worked for y'all or if you would have gone about it a different way, or just or you think it just undervalues kind of the way that society is set up right now in regards to human rights. Central to human security is the idea that individual must be primary referent and beneficiary of security policy and security analysis. But rights-based ethics are conceptually and morally problematic for a number of reasons. This is not to say that rights and the freedoms that they seek to protect are not important, rather to suggest that the concepts of rights alone may not be able to do the moral work that it needs to be in order to provide a complete ethics. And that's kind of what she says. And I thought it was really interesting that she thought they're conceptually like problematic for a number of reasons. Because I mean, I definitely kind of see where she's coming from. I'm just like, I don't know, it felt a little harsh, but of course she's trying to be critical, so I understand that. Dominant approaches to rights, including rights as they were widely conceptualized and articulated by Western states, international organizations, and large Western civil society groups, are most often based on the ontology of atomistic individualism that privileges the norm of self-sufficiency and neglects the relation care of human existence and fundamental nature of the human need to give and receive adequate care. So I thought that like this was really interesting because like again, she said it was problematic and those for another reasons and like whether or not we believe that all of those reasons are problematic. I do think that she definitely made like a really good point here and saying that like the current society and the way that we have our rights written up and everything, like even though to an extent we have these human rights that are supposed to be inclusive and everything, obviously they come from a very like Western centric idea. And you know, and what in this idea that we're trying to constantly push human rights, but of course, like we definitely don't, and we don't accomplish the bare minimum. So I think that's more of kind of the conversation she's trying to have here. She goes on to say the individual becomes the primary reference for security in the state, seen as potential threat, and the realization of individual human rights is often regarded as the end antithetical and substance key to achieving human security. The discourse of individual rights cannot alone effectively address the complex sets of relations that both lead to situations of human insecurity and can ultimately find lasting solutions to insecurity. And I think that's really important too. I thought that was one of her like really important arguments that she made here, was just saying, you know, that they can't alone. And I think like, and again, I think this kind of comes back maybe to like this hypocrisy kind of thing, because I feel like she just goes back and forth a lot, which is fine. But it's a little weird to me because I feel like in some sentences she seems like she really doesn't want human rights to be, you know, part of everything. But I think it's more of like, you know, she doesn't want it to be the bare minimum or you know, how do I want to describe this? I think that like the level at which it is just not like enough for her. And it shouldn't be. And I think that, you know, applies to us as well. I just feel like since some of in her statements she feels a little bit more aggressive than others. And maybe that's just me. But she goes on to talk about relational context, and this is kind of a overall theme like throughout the book of like this idea of relation and relationships. But she goes on to say relations of care will exist in a variety of different levels, from household to international government and even non-governmental organizations. Relationships of responsibility and care determine who takes up arms in political conflicts and who receives crucial medication and care in conditions of scarcity of resources and time. So obviously, you know, relationships, especially when it comes to care, have like a very pivotal role and impact on everything. And so she's essentially saying that, you know, these relations of care and care ethics are go outside of the whole household and even intertwine in international government, in regular or you know, in your own government, your own nation state, and then even more so in like bureaucracy and non-governmental organizations. And then my second question that I have for today, and it kind of is regards into the relationships of responsibility and care that determines like, you know, who's in charge and who has all the power. And I kind of asked the question in the case of minorities who struggle to make like a relational connection with their government, which of course is no fault of their own. Like, you know, like that's the government creating that separation and that divide. And you know, maybe this is a fairly basic question. I mean, this just, you know, asks for some very basic changes in our government and the system. But in what ways can we kind of change the system to make it a better opportunity for relationship building regarding those minorities who have already been like so oppressed and targeted that is like potentially severed, you know, like a relationship between a government that obviously um, does not work in favor of them, and a person and these people who have been trying to make that connection for so long and are frankly tired of it. So do you think there is a way for relationship building in that case or not? And I'll see you in chapter 3.